Welcome to the world of the Roman legions, where honor is earned with sweat and an unshakable shield wall. Now, I want you to find your most comfortable spot. Go on, settle in. Let your shoulders drop and take a slow, deep breath, releasing the day's worries with the exhale. Where are you joining me from? Is it late in your part of the world? Or are you just beginning your own grand campaign against the day's schedule? If you enjoy this time we spend together, a gentle tap on the subscribe button ensures we can travel again soon. Our journey tonight begins not with a general's map, but with the worn leather sandals of a single soldier. You are Marcus Valerius Corvus, a new recruit whose only real armor is a desperate need to redeem your family's name. The training grounds are unforgiving, a place where men stop often for water and learn that discipline is more important than strength. Your muscles ache, and the centurion's voice is a constant bark in your ear, shaping you for the chaos to come. The cart rattled to a halt, and the gate of the Capua training camp loomed before me, a stark frame of timber against the hazy Italian sky. A knot tightened in my stomach, a cold mix of fear and shame. Every league of the journey south from Rome, the memory of my father's trial had been my unwelcome companion. His name, once spoken with respect in the Senate, was now a whispered disgrace. This legion, this life of sweat and iron, was the only path I could see to forging a new honor for the name Valerius Corvus. I clambered down from the cart, my fine city tunic already feeling out of place, and took my first breath of the camp. It wasn't the clean air of my family's estate. It was a dry, gritty current carrying the smell of countless men, cooking fires, and baking earth. My entry into this new world was a swift and brutal stripping away of my old one. My clothes were taken, replaced with a tunic of coarse, undyed wool that immediately began to scratch at my neck and shoulders. I was handed a pair of caligae, the heavy military sandals, their thick leather soles studded with iron hobnails. They felt clumsy and foreign on my feet, which were accustomed to soft slippers. Then came the equipment, the helmet, the belt with its dagger, and a heavy sack containing tools and grain. Each piece added another layer of weight, pressing me down and reminding me that I was no longer a patrician's son, but a recruit, a nameless face in a cohort of hundreds. A quartermaster with a permanently sour expression shoved the last item into my arms, the gladius, the legionary's short sword. Its weight was familiar, but in this context, it felt less like a gentleman's weapon and more like a butcher's tool. This feeling of being a clumsy amateur was cemented on the training field. An instructor, a man whose voice was a harsh mix of sounds like gravel being ground under a cartwheel, barked commands that seemed to blur into one another. We were to march. It sounded simple enough. Yet, keeping in step with the men around me, all while balancing the awkward weight of my gear, was a torment. My movements, which I had always considered graceful, became a series of stumbles and awkward recoveries. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation as I glanced at the men beside me. They were farmers, laborers, and fishermen from the provinces. men I would never have spoken to in Rome. But here, their bodies, hardened by real work, responded to the discipline with a natural rhythm I simply could not find. The greatest source of my misery, however, was the scutum. This was the large, curved shield of the Legionary, a monstrous thing of wood, leather, and iron. Lifting it was one thing, holding it correctly while marching was another entirely. Its sharp metal edge banged against my shin, and the strain of holding its central grip made my arm tremble uncontrollably after only a few minutes. From across the dusty field, I felt a pair of eyes on me. It was a centurion, a grizzled veteran with a face that looked like it had been carved from old wood. He leaned on his vine staff, the symbol of his rank, and watched my struggle not with sympathy, but with a cold, undisguised contempt. He saw me for what I was, a soft boy from the city, playing at being a soldier. A bitter conflict raged within me. Part of me, the part that had been raised on stories of my ancestors commanding armies, recoiled at the idea that I was inferior to these common men. I was a Valerius. My blood was noble. Yet my aching muscles and shaking hands told a different story. The baker's son from Gaul to my right held his shield steady, his face a mask of concentration. A fisherman from Hispania to my left marched as if he had been born with hobnailed sandals on his feet. The humbling reality was that my patrician pride was worthless here. On this field, under the watchful eye of that centurion, a man's worth was measured in sweat and endurance, currencies in which I was utterly impoverished. That first day of drills felt as long as a lifetime. We ran until my lungs burned and my throat was raw with dust. We practiced formations, a chaotic shuffling of bodies where I always seemed to be in the wrong place. We trained with the rudis, a heavy wooden practice sword, against thick wooden posts. My arms grew so tired that lifting the sword felt like trying to lift a fallen log. The instructor stalked between the ranks, his staff striking sharply across the backs of those who faltered. The sting of his blow on my own shoulders was less painful than the public shame it represented. When we were finally dismissed, I didn't walk from the field. I staggered, every part of my body screaming in protest. The sun had begun to dip toward the horizon, and the long shadows of the barracks offered the first real comfort I had felt all day. This stripping of dignity continued with the evening meal. We lined up with our simple wooden bowls to receive a ladleful of thick barley porridge. It was gray, lumpy, and tasted of little more than grit and warm water. I thought of the meals at my father's table: roasted meats, sweet fruits, bread made with the finest flour, all washed down with watered wine from our own vineyards. Here, the taste was of pure survival. As I forced the pasty substance down, I watched the other recruits. They ate quickly, without complaint, some even laughing with their neighbors. For them, perhaps, this was no worse than what they were used to. For me, it was another reminder of how far I had fallen, of the chasm that separated my old life from this new, harsh existence. Sleep offered little escape. I was assigned a space on a straw pallet inside a long, low barracks building I would share with dozens of other men. The building was filled with the sounds of weary humanity, coughing, snoring, the murmur of conversations in strange provincial accents, and the constant smell of unwashed bodies and sour wine. Lying there in the dark, I felt a profound sense of loneliness that was sharper than any physical pain. In Rome, the night sounds had been the distant clatter of a passing carriage on a paved street, or the soft music from a neighbor's dinner party. Here, the world was immediate, claustrophobic, and filled with strangers. It was in that moment, surrounded by men I did not know, that I truly understood I was on my own. In the quiet darkness, the reason for my presence here returned with piercing clarity. My father had not been a traitor, but he had been weak, and in Rome, weakness was the greatest crime of all. He had been outmaneuvered by his political rivals, accused of corruption, and forced into a quiet exile, his fortune seized and his name disgraced. I had chosen the army not for glory, a concept that now seemed like a child's fantasy, but for the discipline it promised. I needed to forge myself into something hard, something that could not be broken by whispers and political games. The Legion was the fire, and I was the soft iron thrust into its heart. I had to endure the flames if I was ever to be tempered into strong steel. Just as I was drifting into an exhausted sleep, a shadow fell over my palate. I looked up to see the veteran centurion from the training field. He moved silently through the barracks, his presence alone enough to quiet the few remaining murmurs. He stopped beside me, his gaze falling on my poorly stowed equipment. He didn't speak, but instead prodded the edge of my shield with the tip of his vine staff. The gentle tap felt like a thunderclap in the quiet room. He then looked down at my hands, still soft and uncalloused from a life of reading scrolls, not hauling ropes. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Patrician hands," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good for holding a wine cup. We will see if they can learn to hold a shield." He moved on without another word, leaving me alone with his judgment hanging in the air. His words were not a threat, but a statement of fact, a challenge laid at my feet. I lay back on the straw, the sharp stalks poking through the thin wool of my tunic. The aches in my body were a fierce, burning reminder of my failure. But now, a new feeling began to smolder alongside the pain, a grim, stubborn resolve. He was right. My hands were soft. My body was weak. My pride was a liability. But I would not break. I would learn to hold the shield. I would learn to march. I would learn to be something more than my father's disgraced son. The brutal realities of this new life had tested me in ways I was only starting to understand. The drilling field, which had been the whole of my world, suddenly shrank. My new home was a single section of a leather tent, shared with 7 other men. This was the contubernium, the smallest unit of the Legion, and I quickly learned it was also the most important. The space was so cramped that when we all lay down to sleep, our shoulders pressed together, a constant reminder that my existence was no longer my own. A mix of smells clung to the thick animal hides of the tent walls. The sourness of cheap wine, the persistent odor of sweat from unwashed bodies, and the sharp scent of old leather from our gear. I, who had grown up with rooms to myself, now had to learn to move, to eat, and even to breathe in rhythm with 7 strangers who came from every corner of the Roman world. This close living arrangement forced an intimacy I found deeply unsettling at first. One of my tent mates was a broad-shouldered farmer from northern Gaul who seemed to be made of solid muscle, while another was a quiet, wiry fisherman from the Greek Isles who moved with a surprising grace. None of them cared that my family had once held influence in Rome. Here, I was just another recruit, another body to fill a space on a sleeping mat. They judged me not by my name, but by how quickly I could mend my own sandals or how well I cleaned my share of the cooking pot. This humbling reality was a constant grind against my pride, forcing me to see the world through their eyes, a world where survival depended not on who your father was, but on the man sleeping next to you. Our days began long before sunrise, with a breakfast that never varied, a thick, gritty porridge made of barley. The first time I ate it, I nearly gagged. The stuff, called pulse, was bland and coarse, scraping my throat as it went down. I watched the others scoop it up from their simple wooden bowls with a focused hunger, their faces showing no sign of disgust. They ate to live, to fuel their bodies for the day's work. There was no pleasure in it, only necessity. As I forced down each mouthful, I felt another piece of my old life fall away. I was learning that a legionary does not eat for taste, but for strength. The constant ache in my shoulders from the previous day's drills was a dull counterpoint to the rough texture of the porridge in my mouth. Beyond the simple act of eating, we learned to depend on one another for everything. We checked each other's pack straps, making sure the heavy loads were balanced. We shared whetstones to keep our short swords, our gladi, sharp enough to pass the centurion's inspection. During weapons training, we learned to move as a single entity, my shield locking with the man to my left, his with the one next to him, creating an unbreakable wall of wood and bronze. My personal skill meant nothing if the man beside me faltered. This was a difficult lesson. I had always believed in individual excellence, but the Legion was teaching me that true strength came from the trust you placed in the 7 other men who shared your small leather home. This lesson was soon put to a test, far more brutal than any drill. Orders came for a forced march, a full day's journey under the weight of our entire kit: armor, weapons, shield, entrenching tools, and several days' rations. The day began, and my body quickly protested. My shoulders, already sore, screamed with every step. The hobnailed military sandals, my caligae, felt as if they were filled with stones, and the constant rhythmic pounding of hundreds of pairs of them on the hard-packed dirt road became a sound of pure misery. I focused on the back of the man in front of me, on the rise and fall of his pack, trying to lose myself in the rhythm and ignore the fire building in my legs and lungs. Sweat soaked my wool tunic, making it cling to my skin like a wet shroud. As the hours wore on, the column of men stretched and strained. I could hear the labored breathing all around me, a chorus of exhaustion. It was then that a boy in our group, a young recruit from Spain, who could not have been more than 17, began to falter. His face was pale, his steps grew unsteady, and then, with a low groan, he collapsed onto the dusty road. The entire column behind us shuffled to a halt. The grizzled centurion marched back to us, his face a mask of impatience. He looked down at the fallen boy without a hint of sympathy. "Leave him," the centurion barked, his voice cutting through the quiet gasps for breath. "The Legion does not stop. We make camp in 3 more miles." His order was absolute, a fundamental law of our new existence. A weak link was to be cut loose. My training, my instincts, and every rule I had learned screamed at me to obey, to turn my back and continue the march. To defy a centurion was unthinkable. The punishment would be severe. Yet, as I looked at the boy lying in the dirt, I saw not just a failed recruit, but one of our own. I glanced at the other 6 men of my contubernium. In their eyes, I saw the same conflict, the same flicker of rebellion against this cold logic. The farmer from Gaul met my gaze, and in that silent moment, a decision was made. It was a choice born not of logic or training, but of a new, unspoken loyalty forged in the cramped, smelly confines of our shared tent. Without a word, 2 of the men hoisted the fallen recruit to his feet, draping his arms over their shoulders. He was barely conscious, his head lolling forward. I took his shield, adding its considerable weight to my own burden. Another man took his pack. We rearranged ourselves, distributing his gear among us, and then we began to march again, now half carrying, half dragging the 8th member of our group. The added weight was immense, turning an already difficult task into a nightmare. My muscles burned with a pain so intense it felt as though they were tearing. Each step was an act of will, a shared defiance that flowed between the 7 of us. The final miles to the campsite were the longest of my life. We fell far behind the rest of the Legion, a small, struggling island of men moving at a snail's pace. When we finally stumbled into the designated area for our camp, the other centuries already had their tents pitched. The centurion was waiting for us, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He watched us gently lower the Spanish boy to the ground, and then turned his cold eyes on the rest of us. He did not shout. His voice was low and dangerous. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said simply. "There are consequences for that." Our punishment was as swift as it was harsh. While the rest of the Legion ate their evening meal and rested their weary bodies, we were put to work, digging the defensive trench for the entire century. Our exhaustion was so complete it was a physical sickness. Yet we picked up the entrenching tools and began to dig. The centurion stood over us, a silent observer, as we worked late into the night. When we were finally dismissed, my hands were raw and blistered, my back a solid wall of pain. I could barely lift my arms to accept the small piece of hard bread and cup of water that was our dinner. We crawled back into our tent that night, collapsing onto our sleeping mats in a heap of shared misery. The air was filled with the sounds of groans and the quiet hiss of pained breaths. But something had changed between us. The farmer from Gaul reached over and passed me his water skin without a word. The fishermen from the Greek Isles began tending to the blisters on my hands with a strip of linen. In that moment, the barriers of our different origins, our different lives before the Legion simply vanished. We were no longer 8 individuals forced to live together. We were a single unit, bound by a shared ordeal and a shared act of defiance. That night, sleeping shoulder to shoulder in the dark, I finally understood. The strength of the Legion wasn't in the sharpness of its swords or the height of its walls. It was in the simple, unbreakable promise between the men who shared a single leather tent. No one gets left behind. My father's name and my life in Rome felt like a story someone else had lived. My reality was now the aches in my body, the gritty taste of barley, and the 7 exhausted men breathing softly around me in the dark. I was no longer just Marcus Valerius Corvus. I was the 8th man. This brutal introduction to the concept of brotherhood within the Legion stayed with me, a far more permanent lesson than any punishment. I began to wonder if this was how all great commands were built, not on fear or glory, but on the simple, powerful idea that you would carry the man next to you, no matter the cost. It felt like the very foundation of Rome itself, a truth hidden beneath all the marble and eagles. This shared struggle, this choice to endure pain for another, lingered in my thoughts long after the soreness in my muscles had faded. The brutal rhythm of the training yard in Capua was finally over. I had survived. The raw blisters on my hands had turned to hard calluses, and the ache in my shoulders from the heavy scutum, our large curved shield, had settled into a permanent dull throb. One morning, the centurion's bellowing was different. It was not for drills, but for formation. Orders had come from Rome. We were no longer recruits. We were legionaries of the 8th, and we were marching north to the Rhine frontier. A strange quiet fell over the barracks as we packed our few belongings. The boasting and rough jokes of the past months evaporated. Packing my spare tunic and hobnailed collegae, the military sandals that were now more familiar to me than my own shoes, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was it. The path to restoring my family's name began not with a sword fight, but with a long walk. As we marched out of the city gates, I began to understand that a legion is not one thing, but 2. There was our column, the fighting heart of it all, thousands of men marching with a sound like steady thunder on the stone-paved roads. Then there was the 2nd Legion, the one that followed us, a seemingly endless train of mules and wagons, a slow-moving river of leather, wood, and stubborn animals. The air around them was a mix of hay, animal sweat, and the sharp smell of grease on axles. The men who drove the mules, the muliones, were a tribe unto themselves, their language a collection of curses and strange calls that their animals seemed to understand perfectly. My tent mate, a farmer's son from Umbria, nudged me. "More mules than men," he grunted. "My father would say that's a sensible way to run a war." I saw he was right. Every spear, every bag of grain, every iron pot we needed to survive traveled on the back of a mule. This moving city required a path, and I soon discovered that where no path existed, we simply made one. Ahead of the main column marched the engineers, men who were more carpenter and mason than soldier. I would watch them for hours, fascinated. A surveyor would use a tool called a groma, a cross-shaped wooden staff with plumb lines, to plot a perfectly straight line through hills and forests. Behind him, teams of legionaries would fall upon the landscape with axes, shovels, and saws. They moved with a terrifying efficiency, felling trees, leveling ground, and laying down layers of stone and gravel to create a via munita, a paved military road. One evening, exhausted from my turn on the digging crew, I saw one of the engineers sketching on a wax tablet. He wasn't drawing a fort or a battle plan, but a bridge. A few days later, we crossed a wide, rushing river on a sturdy wooden bridge that had not existed when we arrived. That sense of order carried into every evening. As the sun began to dip, a horn would sound, and the real work would begin. The camp we built each night was not a rough collection of tents, it was a fortress in miniature, identical to the one we had built the night before and the one we would build tomorrow. Squads moved with practiced speed, each man knowing his task. Some dug the deep defensive ditch. Others used the excavated earth to build a rampart, a high wall of soil. The rest hammered in a line of sharpened wooden stakes along the top. Inside this perimeter, the streets were laid out in a perfect grid, and our leather tents were pitched in the exact same spot relative to the centurions every single time. Lying in my tent, hearing the sentries call out in the darkness, I felt a profound sense of security. Out here, beyond the edge of Roman lands, we carried a piece of Rome with us. As we moved north, climbing into the foothills of the Alps, I felt Italy fall away behind me. The change was not just in the landscape, but in my own body. The warmth that had soaked into my bones my whole life was gone, replaced by a persistent chill that clung to me even in my wool cloak. Each breath in the morning was a sharp, cold shock in my lungs. My fingers, even when wrapped around a warm cup of watered wine, felt stiff and clumsy. Rain became our constant companion, a steady drumming on the leather of our tent that would sometimes last for days. It turned the world to mud and filled the air with the smell of damp earth and wet wool. The simple pleasure of being dry became a luxury. This constant discomfort was a new kind of training, hardening my body in a way the Capuan drills never could. The landscape itself felt alien. The familiar sight of silver-leafed olive groves and tall, slender cypress trees gave way to vast, dark forests of pine and fir. The wind moving through their needles made a sound not like a rustle, but a low moan, a constant, lonely whisper that spoke of endless cold. The cheerful buzz of cicadas I had grown up with was replaced by the harsh cries of crows and the hooting of owls I'd never heard before. One afternoon, we marched through a valley where the scent of pine was so strong it was like breathing in medicine. It was a clean, sharp smell, but it was the smell of a wilder, harsher world than I had ever known. Everything here, the trees, the sky, the very ground beneath my feet, felt older and less forgiving than home. One evening, as we finished the camp, a small group of cavalry scouts rode in, their horses slick with rain. A courier had caught up to them, carrying mail from Rome. My centurion called my name, and my heart leaped into my throat. He handed me a small sealed roll of papyrus. My hands trembled as I opened it, recognizing my sister's neat, careful script. The letter was full of small news from home, but one line stood out, written with a clarity that felt like a direct command. "We pray for your success, Marcus," she wrote. "Every day we pray that you will wash the stain from our father's name and restore the honor of the Valeri." The thin papyrus felt heavier than my shield. It was a fragile link to a world of sunlit courtyards and family meals, a world that felt a lifetime away. Folding the letter, I placed it inside my tunic, where I could feel the crinkle of it against my skin. My sister's words were a painful comfort. They reminded me of why I was here, shivering in the damp cold 1,000 miles from home. The disgrace that had shadowed our family was not an abstract idea. It was a physical weight I carried alongside my pack and my weapons. It was the reason I pushed myself to march faster, to dig harder, to stand a straighter watch. I looked out at the faces of my tent mates, huddled around a small, smoky fire. They fought for pay, for land, for adventure. I was fighting for a name. Their road would end with retirement. My road only ended when my father's honor was clean again. It was during that long march north that I truly began to see. Roman power was not just in the sharp point of a gladius, our short sword, or in the disciplined shield wall. That was only the final expression of it. The real power was in the surveyor's straight line. It was in the engineer's bridge, the perfectly measured camp, and the endless train of mules that kept us fed and armed. It was the relentless, unstoppable discipline that could move an entire city of armed men across a continent and keep them healthy, supplied, and secure. This was the engine that drove the eagle forward. A sword could win a battle, but logistics, this grinding, unglamorous, and perfect organization, could win a war. Finally, after weeks that blurred into one long effort of marching and building, we arrived. The great Rhine River flowed before us, wide and gray, under a sky the color of slate. On its bank stood the fortress, a permanent version of the camps we had built each night, but with towering wooden walls and stone gateways. The sounds were different here, the lapping of water, the shouts of boatmen, and a tension in the air that was new to me. This was the frontier. Across that river was Germania, a land of dark forests and unseen enemies. The journey had taught me how Rome conquers the land. Now I would learn how it conquers its people. I had witnessed the immense grinding machinery of the empire on the move, and the knowledge of its true strength was now a part of me. The rain never truly stopped here on the Rhine frontier. It was not the cleansing downpour of an Italian summer, but a persistent, fine mist that seemed to materialize from the gray sky and the endless green forests. This constant dampness worked its way into everything, making the leather of my gear feel perpetually slick, and the coarse wool of my tunic a constant chafing presence against my skin. Life in the fortress was a world defined by the squelch of hobnailed collegae, our military sandals, in the ever-present mud, and the sharp scent of wet wood smoke from the cooking fires. We spent our days reinforcing the timber palisades, drilling until our arms ached from the weight of the scutum shield, and trying to keep the rust from the steel of our helmets and armor. It was a monotonous, grinding existence, and the tension was something you could feel in your own muscles, a tightness in the shoulders that never quite went away. This feeling sharpened whenever we were assigned a patrol. The great dark forest of Germania began just beyond the cleared ground of our fortress, and it felt like a living thing, watchful and silent. The centurion would read out the names, his voice flat and businesslike, and you would see men quietly testing the grip on their pila, the heavy throwing javelins we carried, or adjusting the straps of their helmets. There was no grand speech, no talk of glory. There was only the quiet, professional preparation for walking into a place that did not want us there. My own hands felt cold as I checked the buckle on my belt, ensuring my gladius, the short stabbing sword that was the legionary's best friend, could be drawn without a snag. Every patrol left with a full 80-man century, a show of strength. But we all knew that in that forest, 80 men could vanish as easily as 8. On the day my first real test came, the mist was so dense it clung to our cloaks in tiny, shimmering droplets. We moved in a narrow column along a barely there track, the forest pressing in on both sides. The silence was the most unnerving part. In Italy, the countryside is alive with the sounds of birds and insects, but here, the enormous trees seemed to swallow all noise. All I could hear was the rhythmic tramp of our own feet, the soft jingle of equipment, and the sound of my own breathing, which seemed far too loud in my ears. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of the man in front of me, my shield held high as we had been taught, my knuckles white where I gripped its handle. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart jump into my throat. The attack came with no warning at all. There was no battle cry, just a sudden, harsh mix of guttural shouts from all around us, and the terrifying whistle of arrows slicing past our heads. A man just ahead of me grunted and fell forward with a wet thud, a dark feathered shaft protruding from his neck. Chaos erupted. For a heartbeat, my mind went completely blank with a fear so pure and cold it threatened to lock my limbs in place. All the drilling, all the shouted orders from the centurions in Capua, all of it felt like a distant dream. This was real. This was the moment where a man either becomes a soldier or a corpse. Then instinct and training took over. It was not a conscious thought, but a physical compulsion hammered into my body by months of repetition. My shield came up to lock with the shields of the men beside me, the wood and iron rim of mine pressing hard against theirs. The shouts of our centurion cut through the noise, ordering us into a defensive circle. The world shrank to the small space in front of me. I saw painted faces and wild hair emerging from the mists, men armed with long spears and rough axes. There was no time for strategy, no time for anything but the brutal, simple work of survival. Hold the shield steady, brace your feet in the mud, thrust with the sword. A huge, bearded man charged my section of the line, his axe held high. I could smell his sweat and rage. His axe crashed against the shield wall, the impact jarring my entire arm, and for a terrifying second, I felt our line buckle. But the man next to me, a farmer from Gaul whose name I barely knew, held firm. In that moment, he was not a farmer, and I was not a disgraced nobleman's son. We were two parts of a single machine. I found an opening under the man's raised arm and drove my gladius forward with all my strength. I felt a sickening crunch as the point went into something soft. He made a choking sound, his eyes wide with surprise, and then he was gone, sliding down into the mud at my feet. There was no feeling of victory, only a hollow emptiness and the desperate need to prepare for the next attacker. The fight was short and savage. Our discipline held. Our circle did not break. The tribesmen, seeing they could not shatter our formation, melted back into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. The silence that followed was more shocking than the noise of the ambush. It was a heavy, profound quiet, broken only by the groans of our wounded and the ragged, desperate gasps of the survivors. For a long moment, nobody moved. We just stood there, shields still locked, staring out at the bodies of the tribesmen, and worse, the bodies of our own. The mist swirled around our ankles, mingling with the dark stains spreading across the forest floor. When the centurion finally gave the order to break formation and see to the wounded, my muscles screamed in protest. I looked down and saw that my tunic was splattered with blood that was not my own. Nearby, lying face down in the mud, was one of the men from my tent. We had shared sour wine and gritty porridge just that morning, complaining about the rain together. Now, he was just a still shape, his service to the eagle over. It was a sight that scraped away every last naive notion I had about war. There was no glory here, no honor in this muddy, bloody clearing. There was only the brutal calculus of who was still standing and who was not. The abstract idea of battle, something I had read about in scrolls, had become a terrifying and personal reality. We carried our dead and wounded back to the fortress. The journey felt twice as long as the one we had taken just an hour before. No one spoke. The only sounds were the squelching of our boots and the pained breathing of the injured. The weight of my shield, which had felt like a part of my arm during the fight, now seemed impossibly heavy. Each step was a struggle, not just against the mud, but against the tremor in my legs and the images replaying in my mind. The painted face, the wide eyes, the body of my tentmate. This was what it meant to be a legionary on the frontier. It was not about grand marches and gleaming eagles. It was about holding a line in the mud and hoping you were not the one to fall. Back within the relative safety of the fortress walls, the routine of military life took over, but something inside me had fundamentally changed. The jokes of the other men sounded hollow. The warmth of the fire did little to chase the chill from my bones. I cleaned my equipment with mechanical precision, scrubbing the mud and blood from my sword, but my mind was elsewhere. The life of a soldier which I had sought as a path to restore my family's name, now felt like a perilous road leading only to an early grave. My quest for honor had brought me to this terrible place, and for the first time, I wondered if I would ever truly leave it. Summary. The chapter immerses the reader in the tense, muddy reality of the Rhine frontier, culminating in the protagonist's first brutal combat experience during a forest ambush, which shatters his romantic illusions of war and replaces them with a visceral understanding of its grim costs. End state. Marcus has survived his first battle, but is emotionally scarred by the experience and the death of his comrades, forcing him to confront the terrifying reality of his chosen profession. The days that followed the ambush blurred into a grim routine of tending to the wounded and honoring the dead. We carried our fallen comrades back from that dark forest, their bodies wrapped in their own cloaks. The silence of the work was worse than the shouting of battle. It gave my mind too much space to replay the chaos, the guttural cry of the man next to me as a spear found his throat, the splintering crash of my own shield taking a blow meant for my head. My hands, which had trembled for an hour after, were now steady, but a different kind of tremor had taken root deep inside me. Each breath felt borrowed. Sleep offered no escape, only fractured images of snarling faces and the coppery scent of blood. It was during this heavy time, while I was sitting alone trying to scrub the memory of the fighting from my mind, that the centurion found me. I expected a sharp command or a criticism of my posture, but he simply stood over me, his shadow blocking the gray light. His gaze wasn't filled with the usual scorn I had grown accustomed to. Instead, it was flat, unreadable, like a weathered rock. He grunted, a sound that was more an order than a word, and gestured with his head toward the large tent of the Fabrica, the Legion's workshop. "You're with me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We have work." I rose without a word, my joints aching, and followed him, the familiar fear of his authority now mixed with a confusing sense of curiosity. The Fabrica was a world of organized labor, a stark contrast to the wild forest. The rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil provided a steady heartbeat to the camp, a sound of repair and renewal. Inside the equipment tent, the air had a sharp, metallic smell, a mix of oil, old leather, and the faint bitterness of rust. Racks of shields stood in rows like silent soldiers, and piles of helmets, their horsehair crests removed, waited for inspection. The centurion picked up a scutum, the large rectangular shield that had belonged to one of the fallen. He ran a thick finger along a deep split in the wood near the edge, where an axe had clearly bitten through. "See this?" he asked, not looking at me. 3 layers of plywood, glued with the best resin from the east, rimmed in bronze. It should have held. He tossed the shield onto a work table with a heavy thud. "But it didn't," he continued, his voice low and hard, "because the boy who carried it was lazy. He let it get too wet in the rains, and the glue weakened along the edge. He saw the small separation starting last week and did nothing. A dab of pitch, an hour of his time, and that axe might have just bounced off." He looked at me then, his eyes boring into mine. "He is dead because he valued his rest more than his life. Your first lesson: the battle is not the only place a legionary can die. He can die right here, in camp, a month before the fighting, by failing to check a single strap." It was a harsh judgment, but I could not argue with the grim logic of it. From the shields, we moved to the armor. Piles of lorica segmentata, the iconic segmented iron plates held together by leather straps, lay waiting to be cleaned and repaired. He handed me a pot of fine sand and a rag soaked in sour wine. Scour every spot of rust, then oil it, every plate, every hinge. As I began the tedious work, he stripped off his own armor, tossing it onto the table. His tunic was damped with sweat, clinging to a torso that was a roadmap of violence. Scars, old and new, crisscrossed his chest and arms. Pale white lines against his tan skin, puckered pink ridges, and the jagged starburst of an old spear wound. These were not the noble dueling scars a poet might sing of. They were the ugly, messy marks of survival. He saw me looking and pointed with a blunt thumb to a long, straight scar that ran the length of his forearm. Danube frontier, a Quadi warrior's long knife. I thought my shield was high enough. I was wrong. He tapped a circular scar above his collarbone. Parthia, an arrow. I got impatient during a siege, raised my head over the rampart for a better look. A moment's foolishness, a month of recovery. He wasn't boasting. His tone was matter-of-fact, like a master craftsman pointing out flaws in a piece of wood. Each scar was a story not of victory, but of a mistake. Underestimating the reach of an enemy, letting curiosity overtake caution, assuming the terrain was safe when it was not. He was teaching me that a soldier's memory, etched in his own skin, was the most important textbook he would ever own. While we worked, a tribune, a young man from a powerful family with a perfectly polished breastplate and an air of immense self-importance, strode into the tent. He glanced at the piles of damaged equipment with a faint look of distaste. "A sharp lesson for the men, centurion," he said, his voice clear and loud, "but a necessary one. Rome's glory is watered with the blood of heroes. They will be remembered." The centurion didn't even look up from the helmet he was inspecting. He just gave a slight grunt in response. The tribune, clearly unsatisfied with the reception, lingered for a moment before sweeping out, his fine cloak swirling behind him. Once he was gone, the centurion spat on the ground. "Glory," he muttered, the words sounding like a curse. "Glory is what politicians talk about in the Senate. Here, we talk about having enough dry firewood and keeping the rust off your gladius." This quiet moment of instruction was an unexpected education. I learned that the small leather ties holding our armor together were a constant source of trouble, often rotting in the damp climate and needing frequent replacement. The centurion showed me how to mix ash and animal fat into a thick paste to waterproof the leather, a trick not found in any military manual. It was a practical, messy business that smelled of old smoke and grease. He explained that some commanders in drier lands debated about using lighter armor for speed. But here, in the wet forests of Germania, a well-oiled, heavy set of iron was the only thing a man could truly rely on. The real strength of the Legion, I began to see, wasn't in grand charges, but in the endless, boring, and vital work of maintenance. We spent the rest of the day in that tent, the world outside fading away. I cleaned and oiled, my hands growing raw from the sand and wine. He inspected and repaired, his calloused fingers surprisingly nimble as he restitched a leather strap or hammered a dent out of a bronze cheek plate. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were heavier than iron. He told me about a patrol that was lost because their scout misread the position of the sun on a cloudy day. He spoke of a century that was broken because their centurion marched them too hard on an empty stomach, saving rations that did them no good in the afterlife. His stories were a litany of simple, fatal errors. I learned more about command in that smelly, noisy tent than I had in a year of drills under the Capuan sun. The discipline he had beaten into us wasn't about breaking our spirits. It was about building habits that would defy fear and exhaustion. It was to make us check that shield rim, clean that buckle, and count those rations without a second thought, because a single moment of laziness could unravel everything. His scorn for me, I now understood, wasn't personal. He saw a soft patrician goy who had never had to rely on his own hands for his survival, and he had no idea if I could learn to do so. As evening fell, casting long shadows across the camp, he finally seemed satisfied. He clapped me on the shoulder, a heavy, solid impact that was not unkindly. "You see now," he said, more a statement than a question. "It is not the man with the strongest arm who survives. It is the man who sees the crack in the shield before the axe falls." He left me there, surrounded by the tools and the scent of our labor. I picked up a helmet, its metal cool against my skin, feeling its weight in a new way. It was not just an object of war. It was a trust, a responsibility for a life. The grim knowledge he had shared felt both a terrible burden and a precious shield. The weeks that followed the ambush blurred into a routine of damp chill and grueling patrols. My tunic never seemed to fully dry, and the scent of wet wool and wood smoke became a permanent part of my world. My movements in the forest were no longer clumsy. I learned to step silently over tangled roots and read the meaning in a broken twig. The centurion, the same man who once looked at me with open scorn, now watched with a flat, unreadable expression. He never offered praise, but the absence of his usual sharp criticism felt like a victory in itself. His lessons continued, not in grand speeches, but in small, practical moments. A sharp gesture showing me how to better brace my shield on uneven ground. A quiet word about watching the tree line for movement at dusk. This new, unspoken understanding between us was tested when one of the junior officers, an optio, took a spear in the leg during a brief skirmish. The wound soured quickly, and within a week he was gone. A space had opened in the century's command structure, and a quiet tension settled over the men as we all waited to see who would fill it. I focused on my duties, cleaning my gear until my knuckles were raw, and standing my watch with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. I expected nothing. My family's name, though distant here, was still a shadow I could feel at my back. Therefore, when the centurion summoned me to his tent one evening, I assumed I had committed some unknown infraction. He did not invite me to sit. Instead, he simply stood from his camp stool and picked up a long, polished staff of knotted vine wood. He held it out to me. "This is a hostile," he said, his voice as rough as gravel. "It is the badge of an optio. You will be my second. You will keep the records, oversee the watches, and ensure my orders are carried out without question. Do not make me regret this." He did not wait for an answer, simply pushed the staff into my hands and turned back to a wax tablet on his desk. The wood felt unnervously smooth in my palm, worn down by the grip of other men. It was surprisingly heavy, not with its own weight, but with the unspoken burden of the 80 lives it represented. Leaving his tent, the hostile in my hand, I felt a chasm open between me and the men I had trained with. My old tent mates, the men of my contubernium, looked at me differently. Their easy jokes and complaints fell silent as I approached. I was no longer just Marcus. I was the optio, the centurion's voice, the enforcer of his will. The staff was a physical barrier, a symbol that I now stood apart from them. That first night, as I oversaw the changing of the sentries, the air felt colder, and the familiar sounds of the camp seemed distant. The loneliness of my new position was a sharp, uncomfortable feeling in my chest, more unsettling than any fear I had felt in battle. This new reality was put to a harsh test only a few days later. A dispute over a game of dice, fueled by cheap, sour wine, escalated into a brawl between two soldiers. Unfortunately, they were both men from my original tent group, men I had carried on forced marches and shared stale bread with. I arrived to find them grappling in the mud, their faces bloody and their tunics torn, a circle of soldiers urging them on. My first instinct was to pull them apart, to speak to them as a friend and remind them of the bonds we shared. But when I stepped into the circle, clutching the vine staff, I felt the eyes of the entire century settle upon me. They were not watching a friend, they were watching an officer. I found myself caught between two impossible paths. On one hand was the loyalty I felt to these men, the memory of shared hardship. A quiet word and some extra duty might settle the matter and preserve what was left of our camaraderie. On the other hand, the centurion's harsh lessons echoed in my mind. He believed discipline was the heart of the legion. A single moment of weakness could spread like a sickness, rotting the entire unit from within. Public brawling was a serious offense, and the rules were clear. Every man watching this spectacle knew the prescribed punishment, and they were all waiting to see if I, the new optio, had the stomach to enforce it. My throat was dry as I gave the order to bind them. The two men, my friends, looked at me with a mixture of shock and betrayal. I avoided their gaze, my own hands trembling slightly as I gripped the hastile. I ordered the flogging, the standard punishment, to be carried out immediately, right there in the muddy camp street. I had to be the one to oversee it. The sound of the leather strips striking against bare skin was sickeningly sharp in the damp air. I watched every blow, my face a mask of cold authority I did not feel, while inside, something in me recoiled. The rest of the men watched in silence, their expressions unreadable, but I could feel their judgment like a physical weight. When it was over, I dismissed the crowd and walked away without a word to the two soldiers who were being helped back to their tent. I had done my duty. I had upheld the discipline of the Legion, but the cost was immense. That evening, no one spoke to me as I ate my portion of gritty porridge alone. The men I once called brothers now looked through me, their faces closed and hard. I had made my choice, stepping from the ranks of the soldiers to the lonely platform of command. The centurion gave me a single sharp nod of approval the next morning, but it offered little comfort. He began entrusting me with more significant tasks following this incident. I was now responsible for drilling the newer recruits, for inspecting the century's equipment, and for leading small patrols beyond the fortress walls. The work was relentless, leaving me exhausted by nightfall. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the cold space that had grown around me. I threw myself into the duties, my orders becoming sharper, my inspections more thorough. I learned to read the supply rosters and to predict how much grain a unit would need for a week-long patrol. These were the practical mechanics of leadership, the unglamorous work that kept the Legion alive. In those quiet moments, often late at night while checking the sentry posts, I would run my hand over the smooth, knotted wood of my hostile. It was no longer just a symbol of authority. It was a constant reminder of the price of that authority. It represented the moment I chose order over friendship, the Legion over the individual. It was a heavy burden, far heavier than the shield and sword I had once struggled to carry. It was the weight of responsibility, and I was learning that it was a weight a commander must carry alone. Each command I gave, each decision I made, etched a new line of separation between my past and my present. I still slept in the same camp and ate the same food, but the world I inhabited was different. It was a world of cold calculations, of necessary sacrifices, and of a profound, unceasing solitude. I thought of my father and the disgrace he had brought upon our name. He had failed in his duties as a commander. I would not. This new path I was on, this lonely road of command, had fundamentally changed how I saw the men I led and the very structure of the world we occupied. The order for redeployment came with the autumn rains, washing the last of the German mud from our gear as we marched south and west. Gaul was different. The forests here felt older, less menacing than the dark woods across the Rhine, with vast clearings and the signs of long settlement everywhere. Instead of the constant chilling dampness that seeped into your bones, a crispness accompanied the wind, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. My promotion to Optio still felt strange. The hostile, the staff of my new rank, was a constant weight in my hand, its wood smoothed by the grip of men before me. It was a simple tool, meant for dressing the ranks and keeping discipline. Yet it felt heavier than my shield and sword combined. It was the weight of responsibility for the men who now looked to me for direction, men who had been my equals only months before. With this new authority came new companions, not all of them welcome. Our legion was joined by a political tribune, a man whose armor was polished to a mirror shine, and whose cloak was a shade of crimson too fine for any campaign. He came from a powerful family in Rome, and his ambition was a palpable thing, a sharp scent like sour wine that clung to him. He walked among us, but he was not one of us. His hands were soft, his eyes constantly calculating, and he viewed the campaign not as a matter of survival and duty, but as a series of steps on his ladder back to the Senate. He attached himself to our cohort's command staff, his presence a constant, irritating reminder of the world of politics that we soldiers preferred to forget. Consequently, when the legate ordered a deep foraging party to secure grain for the winter, the tribune announced he would accompany us. My centurion, a grim man named Longinus, simply grunted and assigned the task to me. "Take 20 men, Optio," he'd said, his gaze lingering for a moment on the tribune, "and keep your wits about you. There are more kinds of vipers in these woods than the ones that slither." I understood his meaning perfectly. The men I chose were veterans, their faces familiar maps of past campaigns. As we moved through the trees, the crunch of our caligae on the forest floor was the only sound for a long time. One of the men, a wiry legionary from Hispania, joked quietly that the Gauls built their roads crooked just to annoy us. A low chuckle ran through the small column, a brief moment of warmth before we returned to the focused silence of the patrol. After several hours, we found what we were looking for: a small village nestled in a valley, a collection of round thatched roof houses from which thin plumes of smoke rose. We approached with caution, shields ready, but the place was quiet. There were no warriors in sight, only farmers who straightened up from their work and stared as we emerged from the trees. Their faces were etched with a weariness that transcended allegiance. They were simply people hoping to survive the coming winter. An elder with a face like a carved piece of oak came forward, his hands held open to show he was unarmed. He spoke a heavily accented, rough form of Latin, offering us tribute in exchange for peace. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat, a deeply domestic scent that stood in sharp contrast to our armor and weapons. The tribune stepped forward, pushing past me as if I were a servant. He looked at the village's central storehouse, a squat building of timber and clay, and his lips curled into a thin smile. He did not address the elder. Instead, he turned to me, his voice loud and sharp for all to hear. "This region has been slow to quell its rebellious spirit, Optio," he declared. "We will make an example. Confiscate all of their grain stores. Leave them nothing. They will learn that the price of defiance is a hard winter." His order hung in the quiet valley. I could feel the eyes of my men on me, and beyond them, the desperate gaze of the villagers. I saw a woman pull her child close, her expression one of utter terror. My mind raced. To obey was simple. It was the safe path, the one that would earn a positive report from a man with connections in Rome. But I remembered the lessons from my old centurion, the one who taught me with his scars. "Never make an enemy you don't have to," he'd said. "A starving man with nothing to lose is more dangerous than a whole tribe of warriors with full bellies." Taking their winter supply was not a military action. It was an act of pure cruelty. It would not pacify this region. It would plant seeds of hatred that would bloom into bloody rebellion for years to come. I looked at the tribune's clean-shaven face, and saw not a Roman leader, but a politician playing a game with other people's lives. I found myself torn between the tribune's direct command and every practical lesson I had ever learned. For a moment I hesitated, the smooth wood of my staff feeling slippery in my sweaty palm. Then I made my choice. I took a step forward, placing myself between the tribune and the village elder. I looked at my men, holding their gaze for a moment before speaking, my voice steady and firm. "We are soldiers of Rome, not bandits," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We require supplies, and we will take our share." I turned to the elder. "We will take half of what is in your storehouse. The rest you will keep, to see your people through the winter." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the villagers. The tribune's face went pale, then flushed a deep, angry red. He grabbed my arm, his voice a furious whisper that felt hotter than a flame. "You are an optio. You will obey my order. This is insubordination." I did not pull my arm away. I simply looked down at his soft hand on my hardened leather vambrace. "You are a tribune, a political officer," I replied, my own voice low and even. "I am the commander of this detachment, responsible for its success and the security of this province. My centurion's orders were to secure grain, which I am doing. Turning these people into desperate enemies is not part of that mission." I then gave my men the order to begin, and they moved to obey me without hesitation. Their movements confirmed I had made the right choice for them, if not for my own career. They worked with a quiet efficiency, measuring out the grain fairly, even helping the villagers move the heavy sacks that would remain. There was no looting, no taunting. They acted as the professional soldiers they were, and I felt a surge of pride that was quickly tempered by the cold glare from the tribune, who stood apart, watching every move with narrowed eyes. He said nothing more, but his silence was a promise of future trouble. I knew with absolute certainty that he would never forget this moment. He would carry this slight back to camp and nurture it into a weapon to be used against me when the time was right. We marched back to the main encampment with the grain we needed, the mission technically a success. But I had traded a simple victory for a complex and dangerous future. The tribune walked several paces behind me the entire way, his animosity a physical presence at my back. By contrast, the men in my detachment walked a little taller. The Hispanian gave me a quick, approving nod when he thought no one was looking. I had secured their loyalty, proving I was a leader who would protect them not only from the enemy, but from the cruel follies of our own commanders. I had upheld the practical wisdom of a scarred veteran over the political maneuvering of a senator's son. The weight of that decision and the knowledge of the powerful enemy I had made settled upon me. I carried the memory of the tribune's cold fury with me as I walked back into the heart of the Roman war machine. Summary. As a newly promoted optio in Gaul, Marcus defies a punitive order from an ambitious political tribune, choosing to negotiate for half of a village's grain instead of confiscating it all, thereby securing his men's loyalty but making a powerful enemy. End state. Marcus has successfully completed his foraging mission and solidified his authority with his men, but he has also created a significant personal rival in the politically connected tribune, setting up future conflict within the legion's command structure. The world had shrunk to a narrow patch of screaming, shoving chaos. The sharp clash of a Gallic axe against a shield nearby made my teeth ache, and the air was a harsh mix of sounds. Men shouting orders, others crying out in pain, and the relentless, deep-throated roar of the battle horn urging us forward. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight, a spring of fear and readiness. The tribune, the same man whose cruel orders I had defied in that small village, stood on a slight rise behind the main line, his polished helmet catching the light. His face was a mask of ambition, utterly detached from the mud and blood where we fought. He pointed with his swagger stick, gesturing towards the enemy's main line, as if we were pieces on a game board, not living, breathing men. His presence was a constant, irritating reminder that some wars are fought for honor and some are fought for promotion. Because of this constant pressure from the rear, our line surged forward again, and I moved with it, my shield locked with the men on either side. We were a single, grinding, stabbing machine. I saw him then, the old centurion, my mentor, his face grim and streaked with dirt. He was a rock in the churning river of the fight, his presence a point of stability for all of us. He roared an order, his voice cutting through the din, and gestured to plug a weakening section of the line. Just as he turned, a heavy Gallic spear, thrown from a distance, took him high in the chest. The impact threw him backwards, his helmet flying from his head. For a heartbeat, the noise of the battle seemed to quieten in my ears, replaced by a dull ringing. He fell, not with a cry, but with a soft grunt of surprise, his vine staff, the symbol of his rank, clattering on the rocky ground beside him. This sudden loss created a vacuum, a moment of hesitation that rippled through the men around me. A leader's fall can break a century's spirit faster than any enemy charge. Without thinking, compelled by years of training and the old man's countless lessons, I stepped forward to fill the space he had left. My voice, rough and cracking with the strain of battle, bellowed the order he had been about to give. Close ranks, shield wall, now! The men, my tent mates and comrades, responded instantly, their movements automatic. At that moment, the legate himself, the legion's overall commander, rode up on his warhorse, his cloak swirling behind him. He took in the scene in a single glance. The fallen centurion, me shouting orders, the line holding firm. He pointed directly at me, his voice carrying the absolute authority of Rome. Optio, you are centurion now. Hold this line or die here. Suddenly, the weight of the world settled on my shoulders. It was a physical sensation, heavier than my pack, my shield, and my mail shirt combined. I was no longer Marcus, the Legionary. I was centurion of the 3rd century 4th cohort, responsible for the lives of the 80 men around me. My personal fears, my quest to restore my family's name, all of it seemed to shrink into a tiny, insignificant speck. The only thing that mattered was the shield wall to my front and the men whose eyes were now fixed on me, looking for a command, for certainty in the middle of this madness. The tribune was shouting from his hillock, waving his arm impatiently. "Advance! Press the attack! Their center is weak!" I looked at the enemy position, a fortified hill bristling with spears, and knew he was wrong. His order was for a direct frontal assault, a foolish brute force maneuver that would send my men scrambling up a steep slope straight into the strongest part of the enemy's defenses. It was a butcher's plan, designed to look decisive and aggressive on a report sent back to Rome, but it would cost dozens of lives for no good reason. I remembered the old centurion's words, spoken quietly one evening as he cleaned his gear. "Any fool can order men to die, Marcus. A leader finds a way for them to win." The tribune's face was turning red with impatience, his shouts growing more insistent. A part of me, the part trained since birth to obey a superior officer, screamed to follow the order. But another part, the part forged in the German forests and shaped by my mentor's hard-won wisdom, saw another way. I found myself torn between the tribune's direct command and the lessons etched into me by the man now lying motionless in the mud. I looked at the faces of my men, trusting and terrified in equal measure. Sending them up that slope was a betrayal of that trust. My choice was made in an instant. I turned to my second in command, the new Optio, and pointed to the left flank of the hill. "Take 20 men, move under the cover of that ridge. Make a lot of noise, throw your javelins, but do not, I repeat, do not engage them directly. Draw their eyes." He nodded, his expression grim but understanding. This was insubordination, a direct defiance of a superior's battlefield command. But it was the right thing to do. As the small diversionary force peeled off, I turned to the remaining 60 men of my new century. "The rest of you, with me. We're going up the right side. It's steeper, but the tree cover is better. They won't be looking for us there. Move quietly until I give the signal." The tribune was now screaming my name, his voice thin with fury, but his cries were lost in the larger noise of the battle. My men followed without question, their loyalty transferred from the old centurion to me in that single decisive moment. The risk was entirely my own. If this failed, I would face a court-martial for cowardice and insubordination, a disgrace far worse than the one my father had brought upon our name. My career, and likely my life, would be over. The climb was grueling. The slope was a treacherous mix of loose rock and thorny brush that tore at our legs and arms. Each breath was a struggle, my lungs burning for air as we scrambled upwards, trying to keep our shields from clattering against the stones. Sweat streamed down my face, stinging my eyes, and making the leather grip of my sword slick in my palm. The sounds of our diversionary force erupted from the far side of the hill. Shouts, the crash of javelins against shields, a great clamor designed to pull the enemy's attention. I risked a glance over the crest of the ridge and saw it was working. The defenders were shifting their positions, moving to face the phantom threat, leaving our approach dangerously exposed. This was the moment. I raised my arm. my heart hammering against my ribs, and gave the signal. We surged over the top of the ridge, not with a wild, screaming charge, but as a disciplined wave of steel and leather. The surprise was absolute. The Gauls on this flank were caught completely off guard, their backs to us as they watched the feint on the other side. My training, the endless drills back in Capua, took over. My body moved before my mind could fully process the action. Shield up, step, thrust with the gladius. The motions were fluid, economical, deadly. Around me, my men did the same, a cohesive unit acting as one. The fighting on the hilltop was short and brutal. We had the advantage of surprise and position, rolling up their flank before they could form a proper shield wall to receive our charge. We were no longer climbing into a volley of spears. We were the wolves among the sheep. In moments that felt like an eternity, the enemy line broke, the defenders scattering and fleeing down the far side of the hill. We had taken the position. My men let out a ragged cheer, a sound of relief more than triumph. I stood on the captured ground, leaning on my shield, my legs trembling from the effort. My body ached, my throat was raw, and the smell of blood was a foul coating on the back of my tongue. Looking down from the height we had just won, I could see the rest of the battle unfolding. Our capture of this key position had unhinged the entire enemy line, and other centuries were now advancing with much less resistance. The tribune was staring up at us from the base of the hill, his face a mixture of shock and pure, undiluted hatred. He knew what I had done. I had not only disobeyed him, I had succeeded where his own plan would have failed at a terrible cost. In that moment, I understood another of the old centurion's lessons. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemies you make are not the ones on the other side of the battlefield.
From his vantage point, the legate had seen everything. He rode his horse to the base of the hill where I stood, his expression unreadable. He did not praise me, nor did he reprimand me. He simply looked at the bodies of the enemy scattered around the summit, then looked at my men, most of whom were still standing. "Consolidate the position, centurion," he said, the title feeling strange and undeserved on his lips, "and get your men some water." With that, he turned his horse and rode off to direct another part of the battle, leaving me with the 80 lives I had just gambled and won. As the adrenaline began to fade, a profound exhaustion settled deep into my bones. I looked at the faces of my century, young recruits with wide, haunted eyes, and grizzled veterans who nodded at me with a new, quiet respect. They were my men now. Their triumphs, their fears, their lives were now my burden to carry. How does a man learn to bear such a weight? Is it something taught, or is it a strength one must find within oneself when there is no other choice? The quiet relief I felt was not for my own survival, but for theirs. My quest for personal honor had suddenly become something much larger. The path I had set for myself, the one I thought was so clear, had now diverged onto a far more difficult and uncertain road. The victory on the hill felt like a lifetime ago. Our advance had slammed into the high, earthen walls and timber palisades of a major Gallic oppidum, one of the large, fortified towns the tribes used as centers of power. Now the campaign was no longer a thing of movement, but of stagnation. We were diggers, not soldiers. My world had shrunk to a sprawling city of leather tents and muddy trenches that scarred the landscape before the enemy's stronghold. The sounds of battle were replaced by a constant, maddening rhythm. The thud of mallets driving stakes, the rasp of saws on green wood, and the grating sound of shovels scraping against wet earth and stone. It was a monotonous, grinding noise that began before sunrise and ended long after dusk, a sound that worked its way into a man's bones. This shift from rapid marching to static siege warfare brought with it a different kind of enemy. A persistent dampness seemed to rise from the churned soil, clinging to my woolen cloak and making my joints ache in the mornings. My movements and those of every man in the Legion felt sluggish, as if we were all wading through something heavier than mud. Morale, I quickly learned, was like a leather strap left in the rain. It grew soft and weak if not properly tended. Men who had faced charging warriors without flinching now bickered over a mouthful of wine or a worn-out blanket. Sickness, a quiet fief in the night, began to move through the camp, leaving men with fevers and hacking coughs that echoed between the tents. This was the true test of a centurion, not a charge up a hill, but the slow, patient management of 80 souls teetering on the edge of despair. The tribune, the same ambitious politician I had clashed with before, saw this creeping decay as a simple matter of lax discipline. He stalked through the camp, his fine cloak somehow repelling the mud that clung to everyone else, his face a mask of pinched disapproval. "These men are becoming soft, centurion," he told me one morning, gesturing to a pair of legionaries gambling with bone dice. "A good flogging for the idlers will remind them of their duty." I looked at the men in question. Their faces were pale, their knuckles raw from digging. They were not idle, merely exhausted and seeking a moment's distraction. To beat them for it would be to pour salt in a wound. His approach was all stick and no honey, a method I knew would only breed a bitter, silent resentment. Remembering the old centurion's scarred hands and his practical wisdom, I knew a different path was needed. Brutality would only break the men's spirits entirely. Instead, I sought to channel their restless energy. After the day's labor on the siege ramps and trenches was done, I cleared a space in our sentries area and organized wrestling matches. At first, the men were hesitant, their exhaustion making them reluctant. But when I offered a full water skin of my own better quality wine to the winner, a few of the burlier legionaries stepped forward. Soon, the grunts and thuds of their bodies hitting the packed earth drew a crowd. Their cheers, raw and genuine, were the first truly lively sound I had heard in weeks. It was a small thing, but it was a fire against the encroaching cold of boredom. Beyond these organized diversions, I made a point of personally overseeing the distribution of rations for my century. In a siege, fairness becomes more valuable than gold. I ensured every man received his exact share of the hard biscuit, salt pork, and sour wine, leaving none of it to chance or the whims of the quartermasters. When my men were tasked with digging a new latrine trench, a foul but necessary job, I did not simply give the order from my tent. I took up a shovel myself,
stripping off my tunic and working alongside them for the first hour. The mud caked my arms, and the stench was foul enough to make my eyes water. But the sight of their centurion sharing in the worst of their labor did more to quiet complaints than any threat the tribune could devise. This approach was not without its own challenges. The tribune viewed my methods with open contempt, seeing them as a weakness, a dangerous familiarity with the common soldiers. "You are their commander, Marcus, not their friend," he warned me, his voice sharp with scorn as he watched me share a joke with one of my squad leaders over a smoking cook fire. "They will mistake your kindness for permission to disobey." I thought of the men in my old contuberninium, the tent group I'd shared as a raw recruit, and the bond we forged carrying a fallen comrade. Loyalty, I had learned then, was not something you could hammer into a man with a vine staff. It had to be earned, built piece by piece through shared hardship and mutual respect. As the weeks turned into a month, the fruits of our relentless labor began to rise from the mud. The skeletal frameworks of siege towers, crafted from entire sections of the nearby forest, grew taller each day, their raw, pale wood a stark contrast to the gray sky. Huge covered ramps, designed to be pushed against the enemy walls, took shape under the direction of the legion's engineers. This was the aspect of Roman power my training had never truly captured. Not the sharp edge of a gladius, the Roman short sword, but the slow, unstoppable force of organized work. Historical accounts I'd read spoke of sieges, but they never captured the sheer scale of the effort, the thousands of men working as one great machine to dismantle an enemy's world, one shovelful of dirt at a time. This immense construction project also brought its own set of peculiar problems. One afternoon, while inspecting the forward trenches, my foot came down on something sharp. Looking down, I saw a small, four-pointed iron spike, a caltrop, half buried in the mud. The Gauls had been tossing them over the walls at night, a nasty surprise for any careless soldier. I spent the rest of the day walking the lines, warning my men to watch their step. It was a strange sort of warfare, this battle against unseen, passive threats. It required a different kind of vigilance, a constant awareness that the ground beneath your feet could be as dangerous as the man standing on the wall above you. Even in this monotonous world, small moments of connection would break through. One evening, a young legionary from Hispania, a boy barely old enough to grow a proper beard, was trying to play a simple tune on a crudely made wooden flute. The sound was thin and mournful, a harsh mix of notes that set my teeth on edge. Another soldier, a gruff veteran from Gaul itself, snatched it from him. I tensed, expecting a fight, but the veteran, without a word, adjusted the boy's fingers on the holes and blew a short, clear melody. He handed it back, grunted, and walked away. The boy stared after him, then slowly, carefully, began to practice the new tune. It was a reminder that even here, in this muddy pit, men were still men, not just cogs in a war machine. The tribune, however, only saw cogs. As disease continued to thin our ranks, he argued before the legate for cutting the rations of the sick to preserve supplies. "They are a drain on our resources," he stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We must think of the fighting strength of the legion." It was a cold, brutal logic,
and for a moment I saw the legate consider it. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. I argued that a man recovers faster on a full stomach, and that abandoning our own sick would destroy the trust that held the legion together. To my profound relief, the legate, a pragmatic and experienced commander, sided with me. The tribune's glare was like a physical blow, and I knew I had not heard the end of it. He was an enemy who did not forget.
Now, the great siege towers stand nearly complete, their tops looming over the Gallic walls. The tension in the camp has changed. The dull ache of boredom is being replaced by the sharp edge of anticipation. The thud of hammers has a new urgency, a finality to it. I walk through the rows of tents, checking equipment, speaking to my squad leaders, seeing the look in my men's eyes. They are weary, they are thin, but they are ready. They are a century forged not in the heat of a single battle, but in the slow, cold grind of this siege. I led them by keeping them together, by reminding them they were more than just a number. The full weight of that responsibility, I knew, would be tested when those towers finally rolled forward to the walls. The siege engines fell silent one by one, their work done. A section of the thick wooden wall of the Gallic oppidum, their fortified town, had been battered into splinters and ruin. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of fires we had started and the ragged breathing of the men around me. Then the horns blew the signal for the assault. I was first on the ladder, the rough-hewn wood digging into my palms. My century, my 80 men, were a wave of steel and leather right behind me, their shields locked together even as they climbed. Going over the top was a blur of motion and desperation. The fighting was immediate and savage, a shoving match with sharp edges. My shield took a blow that sent a shock all the way to my shoulder, and I thrust my gladius, the short sword of the Legionary, forward into the press of bodies. There was no room for skill, only for instinct and the grim determination to push forward. We spilled over the ramparts and onto the packed earth within the town, a disciplined wedge of destruction. The Gallic warriors fought with a fierceness I had to respect, their cries a harsh mix of sounds in the enclosed space. Yet they were no match for our formation. My men moved as one body, a shield wall bristling with spear points and sword blades. We pushed them back from the wall, step by bloody step, clearing a space for the cohorts pouring in behind us. The battle for the town was short and brutal. Once their line broke, they scattered, and the organized resistance collapsed into pockets of doomed last stands. A victory. But as the sounds of clashing steel began to fade, they were replaced by something far worse. From the narrow lanes and roundhouses of the town, a new chorus of sounds arose. It was not the defiant shout of a warrior, but the cry of terror. The discipline of the assault broke down as legionaries, their blood up, spread through the settlement. The sack had begun. Smoke started to coil from thatched roofs, and the smell of it, thick and greasy, made my throat clench and my eyes water. I wiped a stinging sweat from my brow, my gaze sweeping over a scene that turned my stomach. this was not war, it was butchery. The careful training, the years of drill, all of it seemed to melt away in the face of unrestrained violence. My men stood with me, their breathing heavy, their knuckles white on their sword hilts, watching the chaos unfold. It was then that the tribune, the man whose political ambitions I had thwarted in that small village, strode towards me. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with a fire that had nothing to do with courage. He gestured with his sword towards the town. "No quarter, centurion," he commanded, his voice sharp and final. "The legate wants this rebellion extinguished. Burn it all, leave nothing and no one." His order was clear, and it was lawful. But listening to him, all I could hear was the echo of my old mentor's words, the lessons paid for in scars. He had taught me that a legion's true strength was its discipline, and that a commander's greatest duty was to preserve his men, not just their bodies, but their souls. A part of me, the soldier trained to obey, wanted to simply nod and unleash my men. It would have been the easy path. Yet, watching the wildness take hold of other centuries, I saw not a victory, but a sickness that would infect us all. I found myself torn between the tribune's direct command and the lessons of a better man. I could not stop the sack, but I did not have to feed my men to it. My gaze fell upon a large stone-walled building near the center of the town, its slate roof untouched by the spreading flames. The main grain store, a tactical objective of true importance. I turned to my century, raising my voice to cut through the growing noise. "8th century, with me! We secure the granary, form a perimeter, no one enters or leaves." The order gave them purpose. You could see the relief wash over their faces as they moved, their training taking over once more. They were soldiers again, not common killers. We advanced through the chaos at a quick march, shields up, ignoring the grim sights in the alleyways. We reached the granary and established a shield wall facing outwards at each entrance, a small island of perfect Roman order in a sea of horrific violence. From our position, we could still hear the terrible sounds from the rest of the oppidum, but my men were focused on their task. They stood firm, their eyes fixed forward, their discipline a bulwark against the madness around them. By giving them a vital mission, I had pulled them out of the worst of the slaughter. The tribune eventually rode past our position, his face a mask of contempt when he saw us standing guard instead of joining the plunder. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes promised future trouble. I did not care. As the fires burned and the awful sounds slowly died down, I walked the line of my men. I saw the horror in their eyes, the same horror I felt in my own heart. They had witnessed the price of our victory, the utter destruction of a people. They were stained by it, as was I, but their hands were cleaner than they might have been. We had held our discipline. We had held on to a piece of ourselves.
When the final accounting was made, our victory was absolute. The rebellion was crushed, its heart torn out and burned to ash. We had supplies to last the winter, secured in the granary my men had protected. It was a perfect military result, the kind of success that gets a commander noticed in Rome. But as we marched away from the smoking ruin, the smell of burning homes clinging to my woolen cloak, I felt no pride. There was only a cold, hollow space in my chest. We had done our duty for Rome, and in doing so, we had become monsters for an afternoon. That evening, I looked at my hands, clean of everything but dust and sweat, yet they felt heavy, as if stained with something I could never wash away. The tribune had his victory, and Rome had its conquered province. But I had a century of men who now looked at me with a different kind of respect, not for my courage in battle, but for my restraint in its aftermath. My understanding of what it meant to hold a command, to be responsible for the honor of my men, had been forged anew in that terrible fire. The sea voyage from Ostia had been blessedly uneventful, but the moment I stepped onto the docks of Carthage, the world changed. In Germania, the cold had been a constant ache in the bones, a damp chill that seeped through wool and leather. Here, the warmth rose from the stone itself, a persistent presence that made me immediately loosen the clasp of my cloak. My new legion, the Tertia Augusta, was a mix of veterans who knew this land and replacements fresh from Italy, their faces already flushed. The sounds were different too. The clipped Latin of the officers was woven into a tapestry of languages I did not recognize, spoken by merchants in brightly colored robes and dock workers whose skin was shades darker than my own. The very scent of the place was foreign, a combination of exotic spices, salt, and the dry dust that seemed to coat everything. This was not the familiar world of forests and rivers. It was something else entirely.
That initial feeling of displacement only deepened as we marched inland. My armor, which had been a comfort in the northern forests, now felt like a personal oven. Sweat trickled down my spine, pasting my linen tunic to my skin, and the metal rings of my lorica hamata, the mail shirt, grew hot enough to be uncomfortable against my hands. We learned quickly to march in the cooler hours after dawn and before dusk, resting through the worst of the day's glare. Shade became more valuable than coin. The landscape itself was a foe, a vast expanse of rock and sand that stretched to a horizon that shimmered and danced. I saw men, good soldiers, stumble not from wounds, but from the sheer effort of putting one foot in front of the other. Our water discipline, always strict, became a matter of life and death, enforced with the harshest penalties. Our first engagement was less a battle and more a lesson in humiliation. We were escorting a supply train through a rocky canyon when they appeared, not in formation, not with trumpets and standards, but as fleeting shapes on the ridges above. A sudden shower of javelins came from all directions, followed by the high, ululating cries of desert horsemen who swept down, struck at the rear of our column, and vanished before our cohorts could even form a proper line. They were ghosts on horseback. We were a heavy stone, powerful but slow, and they were the wind, impossible to grasp. I saw the frustration in my men's eyes, the same frustration I felt churning in my gut. All our training, all our discipline seemed useless against an enemy who refused to stand and fight. This failure led to a council with the legate, a man named Postumus, whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles. He was a practical commander,
with no time for the political games of a tribune. "Our methods are failing, centurion," he said, his voice as dry as the landscape. "We cannot build a wall across the entire desert. We cannot march a legion into every canyon." He looked at me, his eyes sharp and assessing. "These tribesmen, the Garamantes, they fight with the land, not on it. They are part of it. We are intruders here." He did not offer a solution. He was stating a problem and expecting his officers to think. The scholarly debate about Roman tactical flexibility was no longer a theoretical exercise for me. It was a question of survival for the 80 men under my command. My mind went back to the lessons of the old centurion, the one who taught me with his scars. He had spoken of underestimating an enemy and of adapting to the terrain. I spent days observing the local scouts attached to our legion, men recruited from allied tribes. I watched how they moved, how they conserved their energy, and how they could read signs in the sand that were invisible to me. I shared my rations with one of their leaders, a man with eyes that seemed to hold the emptiness of the desert itself. Through a translator, I did not ask about fighting. I asked about hunting. He spoke of small, fast-moving groups, of using the land for concealment, of striking with surprise and melting away. He described a way of war that was the complete opposite of a pitched battle between legions. It was the logic of the wolf, not the bull. This new understanding gave me an idea, a dangerous one, that went against decades of Roman military doctrine. I went to the legate and proposed a change. "Sir," I began, my mouth dry for reasons other than the warmth, "let me take 2 centuries from my cohort. We will leave behind the heavy shields and our throwing javelins, the pila. We will carry extra water, more food, and travel light. We will move at night and use their own tactics against them." I expected a sharp rebuke for suggesting we abandon the core of our strength, the shield wall. Instead, the legate simply nodded slowly. "You have seen what I have seen, Valerius. The old way is a dead end here. Take your men. Show me a new way." His trust felt heavier than my helmet and shield combined. We moved out 3 nights later, 2 centuries stripped down to mail, sword, and dagger. The large rectangular scutum was replaced with a smaller, round auxiliary shield that was less cumbersome. We moved in silence through the cool darkness, guided by 2 of the local scouts. The world looked entirely different under the brilliant stars of the African sky. I learned to navigate by them, a skill I'd never needed in the cloudy north. We found a hidden well the scouts knew of, its water tasting of minerals, but life-giving. It was here, while resting, that I shared a small joke with my optio. "In Gaul," I murmured, "we worried about ambushes from the trees. Here, I worry about the rocks themselves sprouting legs." He managed a tired smile, the shared humor, a small spark in the immense darkness. Our chance came near dawn. The scouts spotted the faint dust of a returning raiding party, moving carelessly toward their hidden camp in a narrow ravine. We did not form a battle line. Instead, I split my men, placing 1 sentry high on the ravine's western slope and leading the other myself along the eastern ridge. We waited. As the horsemen rode into the ravine below, tired and celebrating their plunder, I gave the signal. We did not charge down in a glorious rush. We simply rose from behind the rocks and threw every stone we could find down upon them, creating chaos and panic. Only then, when their formation was broken and their horses were screaming, did we descend, our swords finding men who were disoriented and trapped. It was not a battle, it was an execution, a brutal, efficient piece of work. Returning to the main camp, we brought with us captured horses and the raiders' own supplies. There was no grand parade, but the way the other soldiers looked at my men had changed. They saw survivors who had met the enemy on their own terms and won. The legate met me by his tent. He walked around one of the captured horses, running a hand over its flank. "They thought we were predictable," he said, not looking at me. "They thought we knew only one way to fight." He finally turned, and his gaze was direct. "You have reminded them that Rome can learn. Well done, centurion." That simple praise, from a man who wasted no words, felt more significant than any formal commendation I had ever received. That night, as I stood watch, I looked out over the sleeping camp toward the vast, silent desert. The wind was cool on my face, carrying the unfamiliar scent of some night-blooming flower. I thought of the mud of Germania and the green forests of Gaul, worlds away from this sea of sand and rock. Each place had demanded something different from me, something more than the training field at Capua could ever provide. This unforgiving land and its shadow-like enemies were testing the very foundations of my command, forcing me to unlearn as much as I had learned. The challenge of this war was shaping me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The legate, a man whose skin was cured to the texture of old leather by decades under foreign skies, unrolled a map on the campaign table. Unlike the ambitious tribune I had known in Gaul, this commander's eyes held no political fire, only a cool, practical light. He pointed a scarred finger at a cluster of jagged lines representing the Atticor Mountains. "The rebel leader is here," he said, his voice as dry as the landscape outside the tent. "He raids our supply lines and vanishes back into these canyons. I am giving you 2 veteran cohorts, independent command. Find him. End this." The words settled on my shoulders with a familiar weight, yet this time it was different. It was not the weight of a single century, but of 1,000 men, and with it, the final test of all I had learned since that first dusty day in Capua. My fate and my family's name rested entirely on my own judgment now. Building on this trust, I spent the next 2 days selecting my force with care. I walked through the barracks, my eyes not seeking the largest men or the loudest boasters, but the quiet ones whose equipment was flawlessly maintained. I looked for the steady hands and the watchful eyes of soldiers who had survived the German forests and the Gallic hills. These were men who understood that true strength in a campaign was not in the arm that swings the gladius, the Roman short sword, but in the discipline to conserve water and the sense to check the leather on their caligae, our military sandals, before a long march. I spoke with each centurion, listening more than I talked, building the core of a force that would rely on skill and endurance rather than brute numbers.
This command felt different from any before. It was a machine of my own making, assembled from the hard-won lessons of my past. Consequently, our advance into the mountains was slow and deliberate. The landscape itself was an enemy, a maze of baked rock and shimmering heat that played tricks on the eyes. Each breath pulled in a dry warmth that did little to cool the body. Shade was a rare and precious currency we spent in brief, panting rests. I remembered the damp, persistent chill of Germania and felt a strange longing for it. Here, the challenge was not mud and fog, but the relentless exposure and the scarcity of water. I broke my cohorts into smaller scouting parties, a tactic that would have been unthinkable in a pitched battle, but was essential for survival here. They moved along the high ridges, communicating with flashes from polished shields, a silent language that would not betray our position with the echo of a horn. This new method of fighting required me to trust the judgment of my subordinates completely, a trust forged during the long, monotonous siege in Gaul. Our enemy was like a phantom, striking at lone foragers and then melting back into the rocks. Instead of chasing them, we began to hunt them. I learned from our Numidian scouts, men who could read a story in a single broken twig or a displaced stone. They taught me how to find hidden springs and how to predict the enemy's movements by the patterns of grazing animals. We shed the rigid formations of the Legion and became something more fluid, a net of small, tough units closing slowly around our prey. My mind was constantly working, piecing together the scouts' reports, mapping the canyons, trying to think not like a Roman, but like the man I was hunting. Following one such report, we finally located their stronghold. It was a masterpiece of natural defense, a high, flat-topped mountain accessible by only one winding, narrow path carved into the cliff face. A direct assault would be madness. The defenders could hold off an entire legion simply by rolling stones down upon us. I spent a full day observing it from a distant ridge, my skin growing tight from the constant exposure. I felt the familiar frustration of a siege, but this was a problem that engineering could not solve. There was no room to build towers or ramps. My thoughts turned to my old centurion, the man who had taught me with his scars. He would have scorned a plan that bled men for a piece of rock. Glory was for fools. Victory was for the patient. That evening, as the rocks around us began to cool and the sky deepened to a magnificent purple, a plan solidified in my mind. It was a tapestry woven from every thread of my experience. From the German ambush, I took caution and the element of surprise. From the battle for the hill in Gaul, I took the value of a diversion. And from this harsh African land, I took the lesson of using the environment itself as a weapon. I would send a small force to make a noisy demonstration at the base of the main path just before dawn, drawing the rebels' attention. Meanwhile, I would lead a handful of my best men up a series of treacherous handholds on the sheer rear face of the mountain, a route the Numidians had assured me was barely passable, but unguarded. The risk was enormous, but it was a calculated one. The climb was a silent, vertical struggle in the profound darkness before dawn. The only sounds were the scrape of sandals on rock and the harshness of my own breathing. Each handhold had to be tested, each footstep placed with absolute certainty. My armor felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight threatening to pull me back into the abyss. But as we pulled ourselves over the final ledge onto the plateau, the sight of the enemy campfires below, with all eyes turned toward the distant shouts of our diversionary force, sent a surge of cold confidence through me. The attack was swift and brutal. We fell upon them from behind, sowing chaos before they even understood what was happening. The battle was won not by the clash of shields, but by the quiet audacity of our approach. Weeks later, long after the dust had settled and the last pockets of resistance had surrendered, a military courier arrived with a packet from the legate. Inside was a copy of the official dispatch sent to the Senate in Rome. My hands trembled slightly as I scanned the crisp Latin script, finding my name, Marcus Valerius Corvus, mentioned with high praise for crushing the rebellion through strategy and discipline. But it was the second letter in the packet, a slim roll of papyrus from home, that made my breath catch in my throat. My sister's familiar handwriting filled the page, her words painting a scene of our family's name being spoken with honor once again in the forum. I walked out of my tent into the cool desert night, the letter clutched in my hand. The stars were a brilliant, silent canopy above. I had expected a feeling of explosive joy, of triumphant vindication. Instead, what washed over me was a quiet, profound sense of relief, as deep and vast as the night sky. The long march that began in the dust of Capua was over. My father's honor was clean.
The personal victory I had sought for so long, and the path I had walked to achieve it, settled deep within my thoughts, a quiet weight of lessons learned and duties fulfilled. And so, our exploration of how to command a Roman legion comes to its quiet conclusion for the night. The final and perhaps most vital duty of a legatus was not in the heat of battle, but in the stillness that followed. Imagine the day's long march is over. The standards have been planted, and the revered golden eagle, the Aquila, is secured safely within the praetorium. A single low note from the bucina horn drifts across the orderly camp, signaling not a charge, but the setting of the final watch. It is a sound of assurance, a promise that all is secure. The sentries take their posts on the ramparts, their steady footsteps a quiet rhythm against the night. Let that feeling of profound order and safety be yours now. Your day's work is done. The watch is set. There are no more commands to issue, only the peaceful descent into slumber. Sleep well.